Good morning. Welcome to Christian Community Church. I have a couple of questions for you this morning. First, take a look at this. Yesterday was Miriam's birthday, and this is a picture from her 6th birthday. My question is, what do you think these kids are more excited about? What a birthday does mean, or what a birthday doesn't mean? I just want you to look at those little faces and sit with that thought. Next question, do you know what tomorrow is? Martin Luther King Day. It is Monday. You weren't wrong. But it's also Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. He would have been 95 tomorrow. Sometimes it's easy for me to forget that he had a PhD in systematic theology. And while some ministers in America were prioritizing the scriptures to preclude integrated audiences, Dr. King was calling people to bear burdens that most of us can't even begin to imagine, let alone advocate the bearing of. And I want to read an excerpt from my favorite speech of Dr. King's. It is not, "I have a dream." This is from his 1966 convocation at Illinois Wesleyan University. Agape love is more than friendship. Agape is understanding creative, redemptive goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. And when one rises to love on this level, he is able to love the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. And this is the kind of understanding goodwill that the non-violent resistor can follow if he is true to the love ethic. This is Illinois Wesleyan University, kind of a parochial university, but you know how that goes, kind of secular. And so he can rise to the point of being able to look into the face of his most violent opponent and say in substance, "Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We will match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. And do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We cannot, in all good conscience, obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And so, throw us into jail, and as difficult as that is, we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children, and as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators and violence into our communities at the midnight hours and drag us out on some wayside road and beat us and leave us half dead, and we will still love you. But be assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And one day we will win our freedom, but we will not only win freedom for ourselves. We will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. There is something very special about that speech for me. It's not just King's rhetorical skills. It's this image that he paints of being so devoted to the idea of love that he's willing to go to any length for it, and for the benefit not just of himself, but for his enemies. And that's kind of what we're going to see in Corinthians today. Our lectionary passage I'm focusing on is 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Paul is going to demonstrate his love for the Corinthians. He's going to explain their value to them, and he's going to provide to them lots of context that they have missed. So this isn't about Martin Luther King Jr., but he got it, and so there are some congruencies that are worth following between these two things. So beginning in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. The first thing I want to point out is that the lectionary page that our speaking team works from uses the ESV version of the Bible. Not that we have to as speakers, but lectionarypage.net does. And this translation, the ESV, along with many other more recent translations, uses quotes around certain phrases in these verses, you can see, to indicate that the translators believe Paul is referring to a common Corinthian saying. So what appears in the quotes is not Paul's meaning. He's not teaching what's in the quote. He's quoting a Corinthian saying. Now, neither the King James Version, nor the New King James, nor the NASB, here's the NASB, includes quotes of any kind for the Corinthian slogans. They do when Paul is quoting Genesis. But you can see, I think, maybe, how this might cause a measure of confusion. If we look at the Message, or the NIV in this case, these versions go so far as to render this passage, you know the old saying, or you say. So if you have an NIV, it says, you say, I have the right to do anything. But of course, the King James Version doesn't say that at all. It doesn't even give us quotes. Is anyone brand new to this, or have you thought about it before? Brand new? So you can imagine if I wanted to channel some of the old ministers that I grew up under who were very pro-King James, I would already be out in the parking lot packing my bags, gone, because I have just destroyed the inerrancy of the Bible. If you want me to leave, raise your hand and I will. You have chosen for me to stay. Oh, Caleb says I'm... Okay. I'm going to pretend that was a joke. Okay, good. Oh, I'm not going to ask about that. So another thing that is even more unsettling, since you're going to let me get away with that much, let's see how far I can push it. Where the quotes begin and end are in question. The New Century Version ends the quotable section of verse 13 earlier than does the NIV. Now, we're not to 13 yet, but this is just FYI. So we don't even have 100% agreement about where the quotes go. That's a thing. But if we were first century Corinthians, we would know exactly where the quotes go. It would make every bit of sense to us because we would know the slogans. Paul would say the slogan. He wouldn't have to put it in quotes. He wouldn't even have to say, you say. They would be like, hey, that's one of ours. So Paul begins this passage by quoting one of the local sayings, and then he responds to it very, very thoughtfully. He challenges what appears to be this kind of lower level bumper sticker kind of logic. I have the right to do anything, from an unexpected angle. He doesn't just say, no, you don't. He appeals to the well-being of his readers. He says, okay, fine. Let's say you do have the right to do anything. What good is that if the thing doesn't benefit you? Do you want to be mastered by a thing? So Paul immediately says, here's your kind of lazy thinking. Let's raise the level of discourse just a little bit and think a little harder about whether this makes sense or not. Paul ups the quality of thought. He also appeals to the Corinthians' sense of personal value and individual freedom. So rather than, just protest this idea that they have the right to do anything, Paul tells his readers what it is that he is in favor of. So being for something is usually more powerful than being against something. So what is it that Paul is for? The inherent value of the Corinthians. He wants things that are going to be helpful for them. He wants them to not be dominated by anything. He's for loving them. Basically, he's saying, I know you don't want to damage yourself. I know you don't want to lose your free will to a thing. So yes, Paul is calling out sin. But far be it from me to say, no, Paul, I don't like the way that you're calling out sin. I'm against your way of calling out sin, Paul. I would prefer it to be much more negative. Paul says, how about you sit down and be quiet and let me work? And we can see what he's doing here. It's interesting that Dr. King also called out the problems of his day by placing them next to something so much better that nobody wanted to argue for the lesser thing. I'm going to suggest that this is an approach that has been largely lost in our culture and the church. Today, it seems to me that what we're against is far more tangible to the world around us than anything that we're for. The world knows us for being against things. It doesn't have to be that way. Not if the thing that you're for is true, good, and beautiful enough for you to care about it like a 6-year-old cares about a birthday party. So now, Paul's going to contrast some more common Corinthian logic with his own. Quote, food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. But the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body, and God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. One of the commentaries that I read suggests moving the quotation mark here, and the NIV has done that. Notice that the quote here is after the stomach for food, and then the NIV says, how about we put that quote after destroy them both? So if we look at it this way, Paul is saying, you say food for the stomach and stomach for the food, and God will destroy them both. So you can see the flippancy. It's the same type of flippancy that was there when they said, I can do whatever I want, blah, 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 blah. And so we start to see this pattern emerge. But the scary thing continues to be that depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, what translation, you are either looking at some of these things as Paul's logic or as Paul's anti-logic. And it just kind of depends. If you're reading the NIV, you're seeing that God will destroy them both is part of Paul's anti-logic. It's what he's coming against. But the ESV says, no, that's part of Paul's logic. So there's a story about a theology professor who one time held up the Greek New Testament and said, this is the New Testament. Everything else is a translation. And I think we're starting to see maybe why that professor felt that way. Everything else is a translation. And even that Greek New Testament, even though it's as close perhaps as we can get, we still have to process it through 2,000 years of history. So let's go with the NIV here for a minute. This time, Paul disagrees with the Corinthians more directly, but he proceeds to remind the Corinthians of their future. This physical body will be raised up to newness of life by God's power. We will follow the firstborn of many brethren, our brother Jesus, into supernatural rebirth. Yes, Paul is against sexual immorality, but for a very good reason. Having faith in the resurrection of the dead is the compelling reason. Why reject sexual immorality? Not primarily because sexual immorality is infinitely gross, but because God's plans for you and your body are infinitely good. So Paul's taking this nothing is really a big deal mentality, and he's saying it is too a big deal. And I want to show you why. And then the really big deal isn't so much the prohibition of sin, it's the reason behind the prohibition of sin. We are against sin because we're for something that's infinitely better. And if we forget what we're for, if we can't articulate the value of what we're for, I'm afraid we start to lose our credibility for why we're against things. 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. I read myself into a stupor over these passages. There are a lot of different ideas from a lot of different theologians about all of this. What I want to point out is that there are 4 other passages in the Bible that mention this one flesh concept. I'm not going to read them, but I want to show them to you. Genesis. In Matthew. In Mark. And in Ephesians. And of course, back to our passage right now in 1 Corinthians. So Scripture seems to place a high value, a very high value, on the concept of two becoming one flesh. So only in Corinth, where prostitution was kind of like vaping in our culture, does Paul connect these two ideas? Because we see this prominence of two becoming one. In Genesis, the Gospels, 2 of them, 2 epistles. I'm going to suggest that this is the thing we should be for. This is the good thing. It is the reason we're against fornication. This is why fornication is a lesser thing. Quote from one of my new favorite commentaries here. Sexual intercourse is seemingly trivialized by the Corinthians. They do not realize that because of God's creative act and intentions, sex is never trivial. To commit fornication with a prostitute joins the person with her in an act that is to be reserved for marriage. For the partners become one body and thus one flesh. In this regard, Paul puts forth a view of sex that takes up the mystery of the whole person, not only the physical, in the self-giving of the sexual act, one marked by a unity that is a mystery of divine blessing and complete self-giving. Paul's view of sexual union does not denigrate or devalue, but it recognizes its divinely ordained blessing of holistic intimacy. I put the date of the publishing of this commentary up. It was in November of 2022, so it's a very recent commentary. And now, verse 18 to the end. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. We've noted how the formal translations, those are the literal ones, King James, Young's, they did not indicate that anything was ever a quotable Corinthian slogan. How many people through the centuries have taken everything Paul said here as if it was Paul's logic from start to finish? Quite a few, I would suggest. Quite a few. And what do you do when the logic breaks down? Well, you don't question it, because then you get thrown out of your church and you don't get to hang out with your friends anymore. So you just say, Aye, aye, Captain. Whatever you say goes, because it's not that big a deal to me. I'm not fornicating anyway, so whatever, man. But I think it matters. I think it matters because the Bible matters and the meaning matters. So now we're going to take a look at what happens if we combine some of the best parts of the formal, literal translations and the functional, more modern versions. And it's going to get even more difficult, I think, but potentially make more sense. Flee from sexual immorality. That's simple enough. We've seen the whole time why Paul wants us to do that. But now he underscores this thing that is for our good with a clear directive. He may as well have said, guys, just don't. I love you. This hurts you. I just went over all the reasons this is true. Flee sexual immorality. It doesn't need a ton of commentary. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to raise hands again for whether I should leave at this point, but you may feel like I should. Going back to the Brazos theological commentary, there is good reason to see this verse as first providing a Corinthian slogan and then giving Paul's response. It is difficult to think that Paul held that any sin is outside or apart from the body in light of all that he has just said above, where physical actions and deeds not only implicate the whole person, but also have spiritual ramifications owing to one's being a member of Christ. It therefore seems likely that the first part of this line is a Corinthian slogan, used by some members to trivialize their sexual escapades as of no real importance. So the Brazos commentary is suggesting that we still haven't ironed out where the quotation marks need to go. And I'm not sure why we would think that we have. Not only does it make sense for Paul's pattern of contrasting Corinthian slogans with the truth to continue, but the whole congruency of the passage is more theologically consistent if we consider verse 18 to be the fourth example of this. So this commentary is suggesting that the Corinthian slogan is, every sin that a person commits is outside the body, which is what they've been saying the whole time. I can do whatever I want. And then Paul says, but the fornicator sins against the body itself. You don't get away with it that easily. Sorry, guys. So if this is correct, and we don't know, but if this is correct, then Paul is still doing what he's been doing this whole time, comparing and contrasting, and now we don't have to ignore as many theological inconsistencies as we would have to if we took all of verse 18 as part of Paul's theology. It was pretty exciting for me to hear this because I really like it when logic looks like this. And I'm less excited about logic that looks like this. But then I realized something else. The word other is missing from this suggested translation. Isn't it supposed to say every other sin a person commits is outside the body? And doesn't that word other seem pretty clearly to connect to the phrase sexual immorality? Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body. But the Brazos commentary has gotten rid of the word other. Why? Because in the formal equivalency, literal translations, it's not there. King James doesn't have it. New King James doesn't have it. The NRSV doesn't have it. Young's literal translation doesn't have it. If you go to Strong's, Strong's says it's not there. You can't look up the word other in this verse in Strong's concordance. They all indicate that the word other does not appear in this verse. Now that doesn't guarantee anything. It just means that it's a little bit harder to feel as good about other modifying a word if it wasn't there to begin with. So, it's at least in question. It seems to be. So what if, instead of teaching the Corinthians that the granddaddy of all sins, the single most important thing for Christians to be against, sexual immorality, what if instead of that, Paul is simply being congruent with everything else he's ever taught? Yes, Corinthians, sexual sin is sin. Because in all aspects of the Christian's existence, in all aspects, we're members of Christ. This includes the physical, which the Corinthians seem to have had a particular problem with, as well as the soul and the spirit. What if the pinnacle of Paul's message, this thing that we're supposed to be for, is in verses 19 and 20? Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. You belong to God. All of you belongs to God, body, soul, and spirit. We don't lose anything from the gospel by giving up the theological idea of having a worst sin. And we aren't failing to call sexual immorality sin either. We're just establishing an equality of perspective and an equality of response, an equality of all fallen humanity. It kind of sounds like something Dr. King might suggest. And if this world that we're in doesn't see us as believing in that kind of equality, I don't think they're going to take the things that we are for nearly so seriously. Dr. King rightly said, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. But it isn't just non-cooperation with evil that inspires people. It's how much of our hearts we've given to something that's good. It's how much we love what we're for, to the point even of suffering for it. I want to leave you with Dr. King's words as I ask the worship team to come up.